Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Today's Path Forward conversation examines the history and future of space exploration. It is inspired in part by our documentaries, Spacemen and Chasing the Moon, both of which are available to stream in full on our website and in the PBS video app. Spacemen is the story of the first astronauts lifted over 100,000 feet above Earth, not by rocket, but by balloon. Though largely forgotten, this group of daring explorers would be the first to venture into the frozen vacuum on the edge of our world, testing the very limits of human physiology and ingenuity. Chasing the Moon is a three-part series that reimagines the race to the moon for a new generation. The series recasts the space age of the 1960s as a fascinating stew of scientific innovation, political calculation, and media spectacle. Today, we are asking the questions: what is the future of space travel? Who is space for? And how do we expand that definition? This is meant to be an interactive conversation, so I invite you to write questions in the chat box. We'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. A very special thank you to the Yonke Foundation for their support of Spacemen, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations for their support of Chasing the Moon. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Roger Launius is principal of Launius Historical Services and former NASA chief historian. Anna Voelker is founder and executive director of the SciAccess initiative and executive director of the Aspen Science Center. And Loretta Hidalgo Whitesides is co-creator of Yuri's Night and lead trainer of SpaceKind. Our moderator for today's conversation is Jermaine Fowler. He is creator and host of the Humanity Archive, a bi-weekly podcast exploring hidden and untold narratives in history. Thank you again. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and I want to offer a warm welcome to Roger, Anna, and Loretta. It's great to be here with you today. Now, I do want to start this off with a core question, and that is, what do you think is the tremendous interest in space travel, and why are we captivated by the cosmos?
Well, since the beginning of human history, probably even before that, entities have looked up at the stars and wondered about what is out there. And that has changed over time in terms of what we thought about those stars and the cosmos, but our inquiry into it has never waned. We've always been fascinated by it, regardless of whatever time in history it is. And in the 20th century, of course, we developed the capability to actually go beyond this planet and to explore some things, which generated a lot of interest as well.
Absolutely. Anna, would you like to chime in on that question?
Absolutely. I think from the astronomy perspective, I always love to share the fact that over 95% of the universe is unknown, made up of things called dark matter and dark energy that we know very little about. And so for me personally, that's always been really compelling, how much mystery is still out there when it comes to space. And so I think that that's something that really speaks to a lot of people, because there's so much we have left to be answered. And when it comes to inspiring the next generation of scientists and explorers, I always share with students that we need you in these fields because there's so much we have left to find out.
I agree. And when you talk about the next generation, I often see that it's the young generation who has such a tremendous interest in space travel. Would you agree with that?
I would, absolutely. I think it's something that you see across all ages, but I always love to share, especially with younger students, that they're the perfect age for going to space in the future, because they are growing alongside the technology.
Absolutely. Loretta, what would you say to that?
That's so great. Yeah, I agree. I think that some of us are just naturally drawn to it. I feel like, like a certain percentage of the population just has this explorer gene, and in years past, they might have been sailors, setting off across the ocean or going to the poles. But this day we start, or exploring the Western United States or something like that. And these days, those of us who have that just pull to find out what's beyond the next hill, and how we could bring it home to help our brethren, are called to space. And not everybody has it, and that's great too. Some people in every society are called to keep the home fires burning, and so it takes all kinds. And I'm excited. I love to connect with other people who have that understand that pull to space, and how we can use that to help our world.
Absolutely. I appreciate those answers, everyone. Now I want to shift for a second to talk about early space flight. Now, many people may not know that our missions to space in this country date back to the 1940s and 50s, or that astronauts ascended to over 100,000 feet above Earth using only hot air balloons. The early flights to the stratosphere did not enjoy even the same amount of funding that NASA has today. Despite their accomplishments, space exploration was not a national priority. This changed, however, when Russia launched Sputnik. We're going to play a clip right now from the documentary.
The willingness to put yourself in extreme danger simply to satisfy your curiosity is one of the oldest human impulses. There weren't new continents to explore, but there was this place right above us. We were able to exert that human impulse to get there.
After 32 hours aloft, David Simons returned to Earth. The Man-High team had made history on the edge of space. Simons was put on the cover of Life magazine, and the New York Times celebrated him as the first spaceman.
Everybody connected with the project, including John Paul Stapp, thought that this was going to be the mission that brought space research into the fore at the Air Force and really got them the respect and the funding that they thought they deserved. What happened, in fact, was, in spite of the celebrity that David Simons experienced, they had pretty much exhausted their funding, and they did not have enough money even to do the full analysis of the data they'd gathered on the flight, much less begin seriously talking about another flight.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
October the 4th, 1957, the Soviets announce, hey, guess what? We've got Sputnik orbiting the Earth, and you don't. For Americans, it was a genuine shock.
For a decade, the Americans and the Soviets had been vying for geopolitical dominance. Now, Sputnik had caught the United States completely off guard. Almost overnight, putting a man in space became a national priority.
Now that clip was from Spaceman, and my next question is going to be for you, Roger. How did the Cold War between the US and the USSR fuel the space race?
Well, it was critical to the decision to expend resources against this particular activity. The United States and the Soviet Union was locked in a death struggle. They were like two scorpions in a bottle. There was going to be a winner and there was going to be a loser. And one of the greatest areas of competition to demonstrate to the rest of the world what you could do was in the technology of spaceflight. So this became an early area in which the Americans and the Russians competed with each other, and that took dollars. And the floodgates were opened really with the beginning of the space activities of the Soviet Union with Sputnik in 1957 and thereafter. And we succeeded in achieving a great deal because of that capability. But it was the Cold War that really forced the activity for the United States, and it did the same for the Soviet Union as they were seeking to accomplish the same sort of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, when President Kennedy announced in 1961 that we were going to put a man on the moon, 60% of the public said they didn't support spending, it was around $40 billion, right, to make that happen. Now, how was NASA able to sell this space program to a skeptical public, and how did NASA become like this beloved institution?
Well, I'm not sure NASA ever really sold it. Throughout the 1960s, there are public opinion polls, which every time they ask the question, they do basically at least once a year in various polls, do you support going to the moon? And the majority of the public every year, except for the moon landing, said, we think we could spend that money better elsewhere. So it wasn't sustained because of public support necessarily. It was really sustained because of this Cold War objective. And it's really important to understand that we don't have an appreciation for that any longer and how serious that struggle was. When I was a kid in grammar school in the 1960s, we crawled under our desks for duck and cover exercises that would protect us from a nuclear blast.
Wow.
I thought it was stupid when I was 10. But the reality was this was an existential crisis. We could cease to exist. And the Russians felt like that about the Americans as well. And that fueled the desire on the part of policymakers, members of Congress, the president, and so forth, to engage and expend the kind of resources necessary to go to the moon. And that resource wasn't to make us feel good about ourselves. It was to convince the rest of the world that we were second to none when it came to science and technology. And the future belongs, we knew it then and we know it today, belongs to the civilization that can master science and technology. So this was a very public demonstration of that capability.
Now, at what point do you think that NASA became the beloved institution? Because you see like NASA patches on kids' backpacks and shirts. I mean, everybody like literally loves NASA, right? Kids love it.
Well, there's no question about that.
When do you think that occurred? Was it just marketing, or is there a certain point where you think the public opinion shifted toward
well, I think one of the things that happened is in the aftermath of the successful moon landings, everybody sort of thinks back on that now and say, wasn't that great? And we're all like that, regardless of who we are or where we sit politically. We think about that as a great accomplishment. And so NASA sort of becomes this beloved institution that pulled that off. And I would suggest to you that it really reached full fruition in the 1990s with the anniversaries of that success, with movies like Apollo 13, which demonstrated very graphically and easy to understand manner how NASA could do really great things. I mean, this was an accident, but they brought them home alive. The astronauts survived. And that was no small feat. And, it was a successful failure, if you will. And so that changed a lot of perspectives. There's one other thing about this that I think is interesting. Various federal agencies over time have had their logos appropriated for outside marketing purposes by outside entities. And so the FBI, there's caps all over the place with FBI on them. People have never been associated with that. Same is true for NASA. But when they see the meatball or a space shuttle or whatever it happens to be on a T-shirt, there's an immediate connection, and we're all very proud of what took place. Not that it was totally perfect, but that is a resonance and a connection that we can all say, and it really doesn't matter what nationality you are or any of those other sorts of issues that divide us. That as humanity, we accomplished this great thing of the moon landing and all the other activities associated with space exploration.
Appreciate that insight, Roger. Now, the next question I have is for you, Loretta. What is the commercial case for space?
Well, we've talked about like how we've spent all this money as the United States sending astronauts into space, and And now we have the great opportunity of sending private people commercially into space. And I think for me, what I always drew me to space and what I love most about sending humans is that human experience they get to have, that profound shift that's possible when you're looking down on your home planet, that changes the way you feel about yourself, about people around you, and about your home world. And I think one of the things that I'm most excited about, we had about 600 people who've gotten to have that privilege of seeing the Earth from space so far in history. And now with the advent of these commercial launches of private companies who are able to extend that opportunity to more people, we'll be able to double that in just the next couple of years. And we'll not only will we have more numbers, but they'll be able to speak different languages and be from different countries and cultures and backgrounds and be able to share that message with more people. And for me, if that can help us get along or be better stewards of our home world, that's an exciting and important opportunity to use.
Absolutely. I've heard it expressed before that we don't know what we have on Earth until we leave Earth. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Oh, I love that, Jermaine. Yeah, I say that space explorers are great because we don't take things for granted. We don't take water for granted. We don't take air for granted. We don't even take gravity for granted. You get back to Earth and you're like, oh my gosh, this place is amazing. And there's like free air. So that kind of perspective is useful. It's kind of like as an American, the first time I traveled abroad, I was like eye-opening. You don't realize what you have until you've seen something else. So I think it's important in that. You're right. I think that's important too.
That's profound. Now, I do want to shift gears a bit here and talk about the risks to human life. Now, when we think about the Space Shuttle Challenger, and that was like a 9/11 moment in, American history where everybody looks back on as a moment where we were just all in shock and a very tragic moment in American history. 7 crew members were killed. We look back at the Virgin Galactic flight of 2014, and there's inherent risk to every flight. So do you think that it's worth the risk? Should we be sending machines to space rather than humans? And this is a question for Loretta, you, and then Roger, you could chime in as well, please.
Thanks, Jermaine. Yeah, it's interesting because while our robots that we've sent to Mars that have, certainly captured the imagination, there's something about sending a person that really we can connect with a lot more and we can relate to on a human level. And I think that's a really important part of the experience. We're not just going to learn things. We're going to learn to live beyond our home world, and a robot can't learn to do that. I like to liken it to saying, well, would you want to send a rover to Paris for your honeymoon? It'll take great pictures of Paris for you, but there's something about like wanting to be there and having that experience for yourself. I remember being, I was in 6th grade when the Challenger accident occurred in 1986, and that was a tough day. Everyone was really overwhelmed, and there's a lot of questioning, like, should we do this? Is it worth it? And even at 12 years old, I knew that it was important, that it was worth whatever we had to pay to ensure the survival of our species and take care of our own. And I remember saying, like, I would fly on the space shuttle, the next day if I could, because it was that important to me. I know, it was worth my life to have this dream come true. Absolutely.
Roger, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. I approach it slightly differently. There's risk in everything, and I think it's important to understand that. We can't get out of bed in the morning without taking a risk. We could fall on something, crack our head open, and that'd be it. Quite frankly, we couldn't stay in bed either without taking a risk because the ceiling could fall on us, or you name it. So your life is filled with risk. We calculate those risks and we make decisions about what we're willing to do and not do based upon those calculations. Can I cross the street before that car arrives? And we do this all the time without thinking about it. Space flight is exactly the same way. There are risks involved. There's no question about that. People can die. People have died. People will die in the future. Mm-hmm. And there's no way around that. Does that mean we shouldn't do it because of that? I don't think so. We need to understand the risks as best we can. We need to minimize those risks as much as possible. We need to build better technologies that will reduce the amount of risk that is involved. all of those are important things, but that's far different than saying we shouldn't do it at all because it is risky. And
Right.
I find it a false argument when people make that particular case.
Absolutely. Well, I want to shift now then to more of the benefits of space travel. And I want to ask this question, starting with Loretta. What has been the impact of the space race on modern technology? What scientific innovations has space enabled for us to enjoy in our everyday lives?
Well, we definitely are living in the future. You know, we have instantaneous communication thanks to these satellites that people dreamed up in the the 50s and 60s, and we have the GPS satellites that help us, find our way to wherever we want to go on our phone. And our phones themselves are miracles. Battery technology are the things we first started to really pioneer in the Apollo program. And, just even a lot of the innovation that we have in the tech sector comes from people who are inspired by Apollo and went out and learned all these things. Even in the aspect that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts is climate change. A lot of the monitoring we do of our home world is from satellites that are in space that are, taking the pulse of Mother Earth. And so I'm very grateful that we have all the space tech we do in our world to make our lives better and be better citizens of Spaceship Earth.
Absolutely. Anna, what would you say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with all of Loretta's points. I love the concept that we're living in the future and also using space travel and current space technologies to better prepare for our future on Earth and beyond. And so I think we've seen some amazing examples of that from the International Space Station and their science research program that they have happening there. And that's been happening for a decade now. And so one of my favorite projects to share is something called Project Veggie, which is actually studying how plants grow in a microgravity environment. And this is something that I especially love because it's not only doing research that's crucial for the survival of our species long term, but it's also involving students in it. And so this is actually a citizen science project where students in high schools across America are able to grow plants in their own veggie chambers in their classroom, and they report that data back to NASA, with the idea being if it can survive in a high school classroom, that says something about how well it will survive in space and the durability of different plant species. And so I think it's a really great way to use current science research to engage young learners now.
Absolutely. Roger, you care to chime in on this one?
Oh, of course. Sometimes we tend to simplify this argument about benefits down to things like technology that has found its way into everyday life. NASA refers to them as spinoffs. And those are real, they do exist. But I'd like to back off and ask a slightly different question, and it's already been alluded to with Loretta's comments. Think about how your life would be different if we did not fly in space. You can take away global instantaneous telecommunications, for starters. And there might be some of us who would say that'd be a good thing, but probably not most of us. And your GPS navigation system and all of the other things that are applications that you use on a pretty regular basis that have satellites in orbit that are doing things to help us here. That's very real. But then there are other things that are broader than that. And I like to point to something like the Mission Control Center. Everybody's seen the pictures of the rows of individuals who are sitting there during a space mission. It goes back to the 1960s, where each of them have an assigned task. Each of them are connected through a communication system to direct various aspects of the space mission. What's fascinating about that is how it has been replicated worldwide. Every city has at least one of these. There are lots of other settings like this, crisis centers that manage all kinds of stuff in a major city, fire, rescue, whatever it happens to be. It's all modeled on the Mission Control Center, made, not necessarily invented by NASA, but publicized by NASA in a pretty fundamental way, and has been adopted literally worldwide. There's imagery from all over the world in which this has happened. I would contend to you that that is a very specific thing made possible through NASA's efforts that we are now using all the time to make our life a better thing right here where we are. And I could go on and on with stuff like that, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Well, I asked my 8-year-old son this question: what is the benefit of going to space? And he said, with all seriousness in his voice, so that we could find out if aliens exist once and for all. And I'm sure he probably mimics a lot of other people.
That is the great question of the cosmos, as far as I'm concerned. Are we alone in the universe? I'd love to find the answer to that. I don't believe we're alone. I think they're out there. I don't believe they're visiting us, but I sure would like to find out.
Absolutely. Now, one of my favorite quotes is from Carl Sagan, and he said, "The surface of the Earth is the shore of the cosmic ocean." So this question is for Loretta and Anna, and I just wanted to know, because it's important for us to remember that Earth is a part of space. What can we learn from looking at the sky? Like, how can we associate the universe with Earth, and what can that teach us about our own planet?
Yeah, I think that's the other thing is that, Carl Sagan also is the person who came up with the concept of a greenhouse effect. They were just doing basic blue sky research. I want to go study Mars. I'm going to go study Venus. And everyone would say, "Oh, what impact does that have to life on Earth, Carl?" And yet it turns out that when you start in Venus, the clouds on Venus trap so much of the sun's heat that Venus becomes literally an oven that can melt any metal we have on Earth. And it's a runaway greenhouse effect. And it was through studying Venus that we first started to think about, like, oh, what if we started trapping too much of the sun's heat on Earth and we had a greenhouse effect here on Earth, and where we started to get more of a handle on climate change and what we need to do to protect our homeworld. And we learned that from studying Venus, without even knowing how it could benefit us in the future, just this curiosity. And so it is really important to just let people explore, because those things could become really critical to our survival. And I'm very grateful to Carl for figuring that out and helping us learn a little bit more about our homeworld here.
Yeah, I'd recommend his work to anyone, especially like a layperson, because he put it so poetically and talking about space for just the average mind to understand. Anna, what would you say to that question?
Absolutely. So, and I'm so glad you mentioned how poetically, I think, is really the word to describe his quotes. And because of that, I'd love to share my favorite part of it, actually, is the second half, where he goes on to say, "Recently, we have waded a little out to sea, enough to dampen our toes, or at most wet our ankles. The water seems inviting." And so I just love how he ends on this idea of the water, the endless seas of outer space seem to be calling us and seem to, there seems to be an open invitation to explore. And I think that's really powerful. And that's something that I think speaks to a lot of people. And as Loretta touched on earlier, whether or not you're the person who wants to go out and do the exploring yourself, or to be here on the ground making it possible, I always share with students that it's not just the astronauts. There are countless jobs and scientists and researchers who have to make that possible in the first place. And so there's a whole team of people here needed to make that technology and that advancement feasible.
Great answer. I'm going to shift again and talk about how a lot of people are outraged at the number of resources being used that could help people struggling here on Earth. It's a very serious conversation. And there's a scene in Chasing the Moon when Ralph Abernathy, leader of the Poor People's Campaign, showed up to the 1969 Apollo 11 launch in protest of the dismal conditions of America's poor. Later, he meets Thomas O'Paine, leader of NASA, in what seemed like a moment of mutual recognition. We're going to watch that clip now.
All the signs in the back. You go have a sign, you can throw the sign. They're against the space guy.
At the time of the Apollo 11 launch, Ralph Abernathy led a group of protesters to the Kennedy Space Center to protest the priorities of the federal government.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, On the eve of one of man's noblest ventures, I am profoundly moved by our nation's scientific achievements in space and by the heroism of the three men who are embarking for the moon. I have not come to Cape Kennedy merely to experience the thrill of this historic launching. I'm here to demonstrate in a symbolic way the tragic and inexcusable gulf between America's technological abilities and our social injustice.
Tom Paine went out to Ralph Abernathy's group and met with them. He's the new head of NASA, and they talked.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here because you invited me to be here and because I want to be here. If it were possible for us tomorrow morning to not push the button and to solve the problems to which you are concerned, believe me, we would not push the button. But the problem is that...
He said, you know, this is something that we as a nation have decided that we need to do, and we think that these results are going to be positive for everybody.
We would like to see you hitch your wagons to our rockets and to tell the American people that the NASA program is an indication of what this country can do.
And then he invited a select group of the people who were in the protest to attend the launch, and among them Ralph Abernathy.
Encourage this country to tackle many of its other problems.
As our brave, courageous heroes make their way to the moon on tomorrow, may they never forget their suffering brothers and sisters down here on the earth. May they think about us tomorrow and pray for us as we will be praying for them.
I have a question for you, Roger. It's been over 50 years since this historic moment, but the concerns do remain largely the same today. How do we reconcile this gap between our highest space aspirations and the poverty here on Earth?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, it is a very legitimate issue. And Ralph Abernathy's protest to call attention to that in the context of the Apollo 11 launch was totally appropriate. And the response by the NASA administrator was also quite appropriate. You know, one of the responses to this is this relatively small investment. It's important to understand that the NASA budget is like 0.4% of the federal budget, and has been since the time of the moon landings. So the reality is we're not spending very much. NASA's budget this last year was $20 billion and change. Yeah, that's a lot of money for you and me, but it's not a lot of money when we're talking about many activities of the federal government. So that is, in my mind, an investment in the future. And that's not too much to invest in the future. And we could double that very easily, I would think, and still be able to rationalize it with no trouble at all. And it also would not make a dent in solving these other problems, which are very real and they need to be solved. But it's going to take changes of expenditures in other areas, not just NASA, if we want to try to address those issues at the national level. And would that it were otherwise, but there doesn't seem to be a consensus in favor of doing that. And what we really need to do is change the minds of the political leadership that they really need to make this a priority. And take money out of all kinds of things, raise taxes where it's appropriate, and so on, to try to address these large concerns that are exceptionally real and will not be resolved, even if you did away with NASA tomorrow and put that money against those kinds of programs. It wouldn't make a dent. Unfortunately, that's true.
Right. And despite these ongoing concerns, it hasn't slowed down. In fact, space is the next frontier, not just for science, but for tourism. Now, there's a lot of conversation about billionaires racing against each other to establish access to space beyond just highly trained astronauts. I want to ask you this question, Loretta, because there is this public conversation about whether there are benefits to billionaires leading the charge for modern space exploration. But I want to know, can they help open the door for other people? And more broadly, what should people think about commercial space exploration?
Yeah, it's actually because of all the investments of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson, because they have their own money to put into these endeavors, and because that space has opened up in the last 10 years and it's become so exciting and will be available to so many more people. And at first it'll be the people who could afford it, just like the early airplane tickets were only for the very wealthy, but over time, those prices will come down, just like the prices of VCRs came down. And, soon it'll be, because of those investments, space will be accessible to more and more people, which is what I think is real, which I'm really grateful to them for, because otherwise it would have been another 40 or 50 years just at the pace we were going to previously. So it's good. I think it's good for all of us.
Understand. And I want you to chime in on this question, and Loretta, you too, if you will. Who is space for, and how do we change that definition?
Yeah, it's my favorite question. Everyone. Space is for everyone, and it's something that we need to work, I think, really hard to ensure that that's the case. And so one thing that we have seen from these commercial angles and commercial avenues into space is that people are now getting to go who wouldn't typically fit the NASA astronaut eligibility requirements, So we have folks, for example, with Inspiration 4, Haley Arsenault is a pediatric cancer survivor who will be the first person with an internal prosthesis to go to space. And that's something that wouldn't be possible strictly within, the NASA eligibility requirements. And so I'm really excited to see, more people being able to go, and for us to be really reevaluating the reason we have those requirements. And so that's something that we're really pushing the boundaries on with Mission AstroAccess, our newest project through the SciAccess initiative, which is dedicated to paving the way for the first disabled astronauts.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I know you were recently at the White House to join a roundtable discussion about improving STEM. What perspective did you share, and what do you hope to see this administration do in this space?
Yeah, excellent question. So I'm really happy to see that this idea of access to science and STEM is on the minds of our nation's leaders, and that we're making progress, although there's so much more that has yet to be done. For that discussion specifically, we talked a lot about taking a step back and looking more about disability justice and injustices in the current American system. And so one thing I'll share, for example, is that there are salary ceilings that a lot of people face. So one example is a colleague of mine, Heather Tomko, who was a speaker at the SciAccess conference and a public health researcher. She has personal assistance due to her mobility disability needed for everyday tasks, and that can cost up to $72,000 per year. If she was to ever make more than $62,000, all of that would have to be paid out of pocket. It would not be covered at all. Now, this is a real problem because it means she could never get a job that exceeds $62,000 because she would lose all of the support she needs to live her daily life. So it's really not a choice at all. And you might be wondering why that applies to this conversation about STEM. Well, an important fact is that when we look at STEM careers, just the entry-level jobs are average of $66,000 a year, basically meaning she cannot get a job in STEM and still survive, let alone rise to a position of leadership to change those restrictions. And so I think it's really important that we look at the issue of access to space and access to science in the context of these inequities and injustices on the broader scale, and start to address some of those concerns in order to help pave the way for the longer term goal of STEM access and space access.
Wow. Well, that is discouraging on the one end, but it's very hopeful that there are people like you who are putting a magnifying glass on this and looking to see how we can alleviate these issues.
Thank you.
Loretta, I do have a question for you because you are going to actually be going to space. Can you tell us about this opportunity and what are you most excited about coming up for that?
Yeah, I bought a ticket to go to space. It's a suborbital flight, so we won't go around the Earth. We'll just go up into space and come back down, and likely be flying with Virgin Galactic on that journey next year sometime. And I'm super excited about it. It's a long time dream of just being able to see the curvature of the Earth and the blackness of space, and float next to the window looking down on Earth, and maybe even more so coming back and being able to share that with more and more people and give them that connection with the planet, and make a difference in our trajectory as a species, which is what I probably care the most about.
Absolutely. Thanks for that answer. Now, I do want to go ahead and shift over to our audience questions from Facebook and YouTube, and I'm going to field a couple of those questions for you. Also, the first question is from Deborah, and this is from YouTube, and she asks, how do we avoid imperialism and colonial mentality in space, this idea of colonizing space?
Oh, that's a great one. I love this question. So I'm really passionate about this. I actually encourage my colleagues not even to use the word space colony because of that history, and being mindful of not repeating the mistakes of the past. And we call them space settlements. And I've been trying to think of a new model. Like, okay, well, that colonial model didn't work. What else could we do? And so I've been thinking about, as a parent, I have a 9-year-old and 11-year-old. And I was thinking like, well, maybe more of a parenting model, like you invest all this time and money and effort into helping something learn how to be self-sustaining. And then you let it go and to find its own destiny, its own path. And so maybe that's a hard pill to swallow, but that might be a better method. But it's also a good context for those of us who are parents to think about, well, maybe I should learn how to be a better parent, because this is good training for what we need to be doing in the future for our space.
Anybody else care to chime in on that question?
Can I weigh in on that? Just
yeah, absolutely.
We do need to be specific and careful about our terminology, and we've got a long history of this in the space world, the conquest of space, colonization, colonies in space. I could go on, and all of them sort of conjure up these images of the West. The expansion of Europe into the other parts of the world and the subjugation of peoples around the world. And we need to sort of get away from that. We've made strides to try to do so, not necessarily intentionally in all cases, but I also thought, when the astronauts went to the moon and they planted the American flag, no question they did that. That's a long-standing thing that you see in the history of terrestrial exploration. And typically the leader of the exploring team would plant the flag of the sovereign he served. And by the way, they were all he's, and would raise the sword to heaven and claim the territory. The American flag got planted on the moon, but instead of claiming the territory, they very specifically said, we came in peace for all mankind. Never mind the sexism of that particular statement. What they were attempting to try to accomplish there was a step in a different direction, and that's valuable, and we need to be mindful of that sort of thing. But it's going to be a difficult challenge. One of the things that typically happens when you go to a new place, this is true in terrestrial exploration, is you tend to replicate the society that you left. And so all of the divisions, all of the class structures, all of the racism, all of the things that were a part of that old society get replicated in the new location. And so if we are ever going to have a research station on the moon, a settlement on the moon or on Mars or any place else that you want to think of, we need to be very mindful of what kind of polity we might try to create, what kind of system we might put into place to try to avoid the bad things that have happened here on Earth insofar as possible. I don't know how successful we'll be, but if we don't think about it and consciously try, what we'll end up doing is replicating what we've already got.
And Roger, I think, if I may jump in, I think a really important part of that is who gets to go and who's in power, right? So I think that more than just changing our terminology, we need to be, enhancing the diversity and inclusion, and really focusing on who is in charge and who are making those decisions and who gets to be a part of this, and trying to focus on that aspect, I think, is really critical.
Agreed. There are real challenges to that too, and you know them better than I do. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
I want to go to the next question. This is from Raju on YouTube, and he asks, what about the environmental impacts due to commercial space flights? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Absolutely. That's definitely a concern that I have. And the way that I hold it right now is that right now the numbers of the flights are still really low, compared to commercial aviation, 50,000 flights a day. We're doing a handful of flights a year at the moment. And as those numbers ramp up, that's something we're going to need to really keep an eye on, is how do we make sure that we're using the most benign and systems possible. And I'm a really big advocate for planning for that, because right now we're like, oh, it's only a handful of launches, it doesn't really matter. And if we don't start, investing in those systems that can have a green power source, or use hydrogen and oxygen, where the exhaust plume is just water, which is the coolest, which is what the space shuttle had, which is just the coolest, but is very technically difficult. Or other even more innovative things. That's what I want us to be like thinking through and making sure we have lined up, so we're ready as our numbers go up, that we're not doing more damage than we're fixing.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to chime in on that question, or we still have some more as well?
Well, let me just say one thing. Absolutely right. We need to be cognizant of what we are doing in the space arena that might be destroying the environment of this planet. At the same time, if we don't solve other problems that are terrestrial in terms of our environment, none of the rest of this matters. So if we don't eliminate greenhouse gases, and the number one pollutant that we've got out there is gasoline-powered and diesel-powered automobiles and various things like that. Most of the rest of this is for naught. So while we want to be cognizant of this and work on it, let's not give these other things a pass.
Absolutely. There's another question from George on YouTube, and they ask, we talk about the possible environmental benefits of exploring space and developing technology. Should we be worried about polluting space as badly as we've polluted Earth? And that kind of chimes in with the last question. I think from what I've seen in a lot of my studies is a lot of people are almost kind of saying like, we need to get off of Earth, right? It's almost as if to say like, we're going to destroy the Earth anyway, so we need to figure out a way to get out of here. Like, can anybody speak to that? Because I've seen that kind of recurring in some different writings as I've studied like space history on my own.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important to think through. Like my favorite imagery is where we talk about getting people to live in space to help turn Earth into a park, and help better protect it. So taking your heavy industry and your mining and your production off world. And that's kind of where I want to go. And I think it's important to start thinking from it in those terms. And I also really love, like, I've been a lifelong, supporter of the Sierra Club, the environmental orgs, and they have in their motto something like, to protect the Earth. And I consider myself a solar system environmentalist. Like, I want to protect the rings of Saturn too, and I want to make sure we're not protecting space orbit, the orbits around the Earth from too much debris that's, could inhibit our access and make things dangerous. And so, yeah, I definitely hope all the space environmentalists come out with us. It's an important mission to protect the moon and everything around us as well. It's not limitless.
Absolutely. So I'll go ahead and go to the next question. And this one's from James on Facebook. And he says, flash forward 50 years from now, what do you think space tourism will look like? Anna, would you have anything to say to that one?
I would. Yeah, thank you. I love that question. So before I flash forward, I think for context, I'd like to share a little bit about some of the work we're doing right now. So I touched upon this project Mission AstroAccess, which is designed, to make space more accessible. In the short term, what we're doing right now actually is planning a parabolic flight with 0G to take a crew of all disabled researchers on a microgravity mission this October, on October 17th. And this for us is a way of collecting data and demonstrating that really anyone can work and be a thriving crew member in this environment. And so this is kind of setting the groundwork so that when we look forward to something, 50 years down the line, we are looking at a society that is designing to have space be for all people. Because right now we really have, all of our designs so that you have to be sighted, you have to be hearing, you have to, have, two perfectly working legs, which, when you think about why would we need legs in microgravity, right? So there's some real benefits too to having, folks with different perspectives. And one, for example, is that a lot of deaf individuals are resistant and sometimes even immune to motion sickness, which has countless benefits when we're looking at long-term space travel. And so these are the types of questions I'm really excited to explore with that project so that when we look 50 years down the line, it's a diverse, inclusive exploration project and exploration agenda.
And I'm just thinking now about the joy of anybody going to space and being weightless, but then somebody who was disabled, who was not able to move as much as being free within that weightlessness. I mean, that would be an amazing future to behold, I think, for sure.
Absolutely. Being free and having inherent advantages and strengths that currently are being totally excluded from this space.
Absolutely. I'm going to go on to the next question, and this is a provocative one by Sierra on Facebook, and they say, I read recently that Jeff Bezos is suing NASA over a decision to award a lunar lander contract to Elon Musk's SpaceX. What should we make of this intense competition between giants in this space?
Wants to take this on?
So maybe Roger, you jump in.
Government contracts are almost always subject to review and often litigation. And this, I think, is an example of the same sort of thing. And you've got a couple of billionaires who are sort of duking it out in the realm of the law to see who's got going to get the contract from NASA. And they both have probably cases to be made. It should be adjudicated. Who knows what the result's going to be?
I think the general idea is, people are probably fearful that there'll just be like one entity that's going to monopolize space travel, like you see in a lot of other instances. And again, that will just kind of tie back into the denial of access to others who might not be as resourceful to be able to have access to space.
Yeah, well, that may well be the case in terms of what people are thinking. I don't think we're ever going to see that, quite frankly. All of these companies and lots of others we haven't mentioned here today are engaged in space activities in various ways, and they all find a niche, in some cases a big niche that they're able to survive in. And I suspect that's going to be true for the SpaceX Corporation, for Bezos Corporation, for a variety of others that are out there. And we'll see this moving forward. I really think we're starting to see sort of a golden age. And when we look back 50 years from now or 100 years from now, we're, I think, going to see this as the beginning of a major movement beyond this planet. I'd like to think so anyway.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and ask one more question from the audience here, and this one's from Cameron on YouTube, and they say, are there any common misconceptions about space travel that you wish you could correct?
Where do I start? I mean, we can begin with sort of misnomers out there that do exist that are really silly, like we never landed on the moon. I mean, that's just nuts. And I could go on and on from there, and conspiracy theories and hoaxes and all kinds of stuff that are out there beyond that. One of my colleagues at the National Air and Space Museum was dead on when he found some people using the term that so-and-so is a rocket scientist, and he would just go crazy over that. And with his belief, and he was mostly right, that they're not technically scientists. Most of them are engineers. They are two different things. They're both very important, but they're not the same. And it would make him crazy. So we can get excited about stuff like that or not, but there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of errors that people have and misunderstandings of things. Most of them are innocent. Some of them aren't.
Absolutely. Anna, Loretta, do you all have a couple of misconceptions that you wish could be dispelled right here and right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think a big misconception about space in general and space science is that it's a purely visual science. And so we often have this image of the astronomer looking through the telescope, and that's what people think space science is, and that's what people think astronomy is, when it's so much more than that. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have over 95% of the universe no one can see anyways. And so I share this when I'm working with blind students and students with low vision, to say sight isn't actually something you need to be a space scientist. We have so many different ways to probe the universe, things like sonification, where we can listen to that data instead of looking at it on a chart. And I think it's really important that we're thinking about that and dispelling those misconceptions that space is only something we can appreciate through one sense, when there's a lot of different ways to investigate the universe. And I think when I work with blind students through SciAccess, we share with them that, you actually have an advantage because you're used to working with your other senses. And when it comes to the universe, that's going to be essential because we can't see most of what's out there anyways. And so we need folks who have that experience and who are able to think outside the box to solve these mysteries.
Absolutely. Loretta.
Yeah, and you don't need to be a mathematician or a scientist or an engineer to work in the space industry. We have lawyers and communication experts and safety
and
people.
Historians.
And what? And historians like Roger. Yeah. So, whatever, if you love space, we'll find a place for you. Come on down.
Well, I just want to ask a final question. Does anybody have anything upcoming we should be looking out for? Or do you know of any other space related things or events upcoming? And we can start with you, Anna, and just move to everyone else from there.
That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, so we have a couple upcoming things I'm so excited about. As I touched on earlier, we have the parabolic flight with 0G happening for mission AstroAccess. And if you go to astroaccess.org, you can learn all about that. And we're just received over 100 applicants actually to be considered for our flight. So we're so excited to be going through that. And lastly, in November, on November 12th and 13th, we'll have the SciAccess Conference, which is an international virtual conference dedicated to promoting access to STEM for all. And that's at SciAccess.org, SciAccess.org. So I'm really excited about some of those upcoming events for access to space.
Wow, we'll be looking out for that. Loretta, what about you?
Well, for another 2 weeks, you can still put your hat in the ring or sweepstakes to win your own trip on Virgin Galactic's trip to space and get a tour of the spaceport by Richard Branson. You can even pick a friend to go along with you. You can go to omaze.com and register for that sweepstakes before September 1st. So that's exciting. Your chance to go to space. And then my favorite thing is you don't have to go to space to really have this profound experience too. There's also an opportunity to see a total eclipse of the sun. And some of us have seen the partial eclipse of the sun in the United States a few years ago, but it makes every difference in the world to go actually into the path of totality and see the full eclipse. And so we'll have another one on Monday, April 8th, 2024. It's going to go through Dallas, Waco, Austin, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Little Rock, I think Rochester, Buffalo, and if you're within 8 hours drive, you should make sure to plan time to go see that, because then it's like a free trip to space while you're still standing on the surface of the Earth.
Thanks for that, Roger.
Well, I don't have anything nearly that exciting, but let me say one thing and put a plug in for my former intellectual home. For a number of years, I was worked at the National Air and Space Museum, part of the Smithsonian. It is being reimagined. And it will be finished hopefully next year, that's the plan, and reopened with new exhibitry, an entirely new set of themes and artifacts for display, and a new way of presenting all of this. If you've been to the museum in the past, you know what it was and how terrific it is. If you've never been at all, you should go and experience this new thing. And by the way, if you've been there in the past, you will be wowed by what's taking place. It is a stunning way to explore space, if you will, without leaving this planet.
Thank you. Well, with all the sincerity I can muster, Roger, Loretta, Anna, I want to say thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm going to kick it back over to Cameo George with some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely Past Forward conversation. Spacemen and Chasing the Moon are both available to stream in full on our website and in the PBS video app. You can watch our Past Forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please go ahead and hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, including our next one around the changing role of the Supreme Court, inspired by our upcoming film, Sandra Day O'Connor, The First. Thank you again. Have a great day.